much to fit into like 2 hours. So we'll just, other folks will just blend right in when they get here.
And I do have correspondence.
Yes, okay, yes, and I think a couple people have to leave early too, because they got to get to the city council meeting and other stuff happening. We're gonna get started the same way we always do. So if someone wants to read out our theory of action, remind us what we're doing here.
When we better train our board members before their first day in office and actively recruit diverse community members to serve on the board, we will have better results for children in Cincinnati Public Schools. We believe that the most effective school board members are grounded in their values and mission and know the most important issues affecting students in their community. They understand their role, support their administration, build coalitions, get effective and meaningful policies passed, and make decisions that change student outcomes.
All right, so that's the purpose of school board school. The purpose of tonight, what we want to get accomplished. This is a lot. We're just a couple hours. So somebody read our objectives for tonight. David, you want to do that?
Sure.
Okay.
Classmates will begin to understand the different funding streams, i.e. federal, state, local grants, and how each source cannot be used. Have a basic understanding of how the state funding formula is set and why it has been declared unconstitutional. Understand the different kinds of levies and the district's levy renewal schedule. Be able to articulate the role of the board versus the administration in creating, approving, and overseeing the district's budget. Know how school budgets are determined. Believe that the district's budget should align with the priorities of the board and superintendent. Believe that resources must be equitably distributed throughout the district.
Great. It's a mouthful. It's a lot to cover. So that is our purpose for tonight. And then, last thing we want to do is just review our own vision for impact statement. So we're on page 95 in our journals at this point, or if you've got them written down somewhere else. Let's just take a second and reread or rewrite. What is that? 3 more. Oh, 3 more people at once. Nice. We got everybody. So just reviewing those vision for impact statements. We were just getting started, one of our theory of action objectives, and now we're just reviewing our own vision for impact statements. So remember those vision for impact statements, trying to really think about what difference you want to make and how you want to make it. Jen. So our agenda for today, pretty simple here. Let's do our intro. Jen's going to get the bulk of the time, and then we'll do some reflection and wrap up together. I got a bunch of logistics today that I'm going to cover just because we're kind of rounding the corner on our end here. That's hard to think about, but we are. So a bunch of logistics there that we'll cover at the end. But really thinking about today. So when I was doing the research for school board school and what needed to be in this curriculum, the number one thing that came up over and over again, more than anything else, when I would talk to current or former school board members locally and around the country was district finances and budgets, right? That was the thing that people felt like they were least prepared for before they sat down in their school board seat. And so it was interesting because it would be things like, Heather, we were joking about this when you came in today, but people would say things to me like, I feel like my state might purposefully write our funding formula really confusing so that we can't understand it. And that wasn't even someone from Ohio, right? So I was like, this must be a problem everywhere. And another person who said, I manage multi-million-dollar budgets at work, and I thought I was going to be the budget person. Like that was what I was going to bring to the board, and then realized that public funding is so completely different than what I do in my private company that he's like, there was almost no transferable skills there. And so really, this came up over and over again as something that we really wanted to spend some time on. So we are incredibly lucky that we have our CPS treasurer, Jennifer Wagner, who's coming in to talk to all about this today. So a couple of things during our session today. We've got a lot to cover, so definitely ask questions, but let's try to keep our questions to like the topic Jen's talking about at that moment, right? So she's got a lot to cover, so if you have a question, she might be covering it later. If it's like a big picture question, we can kind of table those for the end. So we can kind of keep our questions to whatever Jen's talking about at the moment. Jen, feel free to be like, good question, let's jot that down, and I'll jot it down and we can circle back to it, just so we can make sure that you get through all the stuff you want to cover. So Jen can tell you a little bit about her background too. I think one of the things that's really interesting is kind of her last couple of stops in CPS. So Jen had worked in the treasurer's office, and then was actually hired to be our chief information officer. So she was in charge of technology for the entire district before becoming our treasurer. Now, I don't know if anyone else has ever has that resume. I've never met somebody who's both been, the chief information officer and then the treasurer. And I think that's really interesting, right, is that Jen and our current superintendent, Laura Mitchell, who was our deputy and head of curriculum, they together that was the My Tomorrow initiative was really what they came up with together. And so with that, they broke down a ton of silos, right? Because it was like the technology team and the curriculum team having to work together. So in a lot of places, you'll sometimes see like, teachers, an iPad will kind of be like a very expensive paperweight, right? Because they kind of know what to do with it. And so with this My Tomorrow work, it was really how do we use technology as a way to make sure our kids are prepared, not just to graduate, but for what comes after they graduate. And so that perspective of working really closely with the curriculum team and principals and teachers means that when you see numbers on a spreadsheet as the treasurer, they're not just kind of numbers on a spreadsheet. You really understand in a way that I think most treasurers might not why we need to spend those dollars like that, or why teachers are asking for this or principals are asking for that. So just gives her a really unique perspective. So I will hand it over to Jen from here to take over. Thanks, Jen.
Thank you. I just want to apologize up front for my voice. I've been fighting a head cold for the last 2 days, so I timed my meds to be like at peak value right now, but it also means my head's a little fuzzy. So it's crazy. How do you do this? Which button goes which button?
Bottom will go forward.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay, so and I'm one of those nervous speakers that not really nervous, but nervous energy. I move around a lot, and I'm left-handed, so I'm always on the wrong side of the room. So what we're going to cover today was like 2 semesters worth of school finance accounting, and so I'm going to breeze through. Is anybody in here have a background in accounting? Oh, okay, good. Okay, so I have a bachelor's degrees in accounting. I graduated from Virginia Tech, and so we are playing UC in the Military Bowl. We did get tickets, so I'm excited about that.
Sorry for your luck already.
Yeah.
I still love you.
Yeah, we're having a rough year this year, but I'm sure it'll be an exciting game. So anyway, from Tech, from Virginia, when I graduated, I went right into corporate accounting and worked in a couple different industries. I worked in the grocery retail industry, sporting goods manufacturing, and then when I came to Cincinnati in the polyresin flooring, if you see like the really terrazzo floors in the banks and schools and stuff like that, I worked there. And so then I came to the district. And I've been with the district for 25 years. I keep changing my career, and I finally married them together into one. So, just jump right in. So we're going to talk about revenues and our sources, grants, the state foundation formula, which is almost impossible to understand, what our expenditures look like. And we don't talk about necessarily expenses, but in fund accounting, they're called expenditures. And then we're going to talk about an efficiency review that we went under several years ago, what the budget process looks like, the difference between the role of the board and the administration, and then how do we go through spending. So as board members, you'll be improving a lot of money going through. We manage about $700 million in the district. That's quite a chunk of change. We take our responsibility as financial stewards very seriously. So, what are our major sources of revenue? You see the big, my colors aren't coming out real pretty on this thing, but the biggest source comes from the general fund. And we're going to go into what makes up the general fund in just a second. But we also get close to $54 million a year in federal grants, and then $14 million in state grants. Right? So the general funds are used for general operating expenses. They can also be used for capital expenses. And the state and federal grants are for specific purposes. And I'll go into more detail in just a little bit. Please stop me if you have any questions. I prefer more interactive stuff. So the general fund, this year's budget was about $600 million. Half of that, more than half of that, 60% of it comes from local sources, right, from property taxes, all the levies that you guys get to approve. The other, less than about 40% are from our state foundation formula, which is driven off of the state of Ohio's budget. So on the local share, we have our property taxes, tangible personal property taxes, and then all these other financing is like tax abatement contracts that you might be hearing about, you know, especially when we talked about the FC Cincinnati Stadium and the tax abatement and all that. That's where all those funds come from. Unrestricted grants and aid is just the general formula, yeah.
So pilots in the all or financing? Okay.
Unrestricted grants is basically the base formula on the state foundation formula. The restricted grants is based on the things that we're only supposed to spend the money on two things, which is career tech and economically disadvantaged students. Okay. Property tax allocation is the state's way of reimbursing us for the Homestead Rollback Act, and then all other operating revenues that come through the state are just other reimbursements. So I really like this bar chart because it shows you history and then from the 5-year forecast. This dark green block here represents the state foundation formula. So this is, if you look at the top of the thing, that's all of our revenue in 1 year. The light green represents all of our local property taxes that are continuing, so those levies don't have to be renewed. The pink one is the most recent new money, which was passed in 2016. If you recall, 15 million of that is put together for preschool expansion, and the rest was for operations. The blue one was the one that we just recently renewed, and the purple one at the top is coming up for renewal next November. So I like color coding them so people can kind of see the graduation of the renewals. But you'll notice that in 1 year it'll be a full amount, and the next year it'll be a half amount, because property taxes are calendar year and we're fiscal year, so our fiscal year ends in June. So when a levy renewal expires, the state makes me recognize that we may not renew it, and we may lose a half year's worth of funding.
So the preschool promise number in 23 is assuming a renewal?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because we're gonna have awesome results. Okay, so there's a bunch of different kinds of levies, and if you look at any different resources, they talk about different ones. But the three major ones are your general operating levies, and they can either be a current expense levy, people might call it, or just an operating levy, or permanent improvement, which means if you pass a levy just for permanent improvement, you can only spend it on capital expenditures. But operating, you can spend on either. Okay, and so they're called fixed rate levies. And so that means when values go up and down, the rate changes. I'm sorry, the rate stays the same, the dollars change, right? And you only get new money to the, back in, I can't remember what year it was, but the House Bill 920 and that cost reduction factor guards against property inflation, so we're not getting tons and tons of new revenue because properties are, the valuation is going up. So they reduce the dollars. Our emergency levies, we have three. Those are the three that I talked about. They're called fixed sum levies. So no matter what happens to the valuation of property, we still get the same value because the voters approved $48 million. So the county, based on evaluation, will change their millage rates. Bond levies, we did for the facility master plan, the $1 billion plan. We had a $480 million bond levy that we're paying down. There's typically, ours is 28 years. They're typically more than 20 because they typically pass them for the life of the asset. These other ones are rarely used. Dual purpose just means you can do a permanent improvement and an operating, or a bond and an operating. You can combine them if you want. I've never even heard of the county financing one, of anybody using it. Incremental just means that you can say, we need new money, but we're gonna need it graduated. So I only made $10 million this year, $20 million the second year, and $30 million the third year. So you can set a levy that it will incrementally increase the revenue instead of being a flat rate all 5 years. Make sense?
Do they ever go down, so you get 10 the first year and then 8, and does that ever go that way?
I don't know, because I've never seen anybody use it. And then a growth one, they put out, I can't remember what year they added that, but it's to districts lose money in that deal, and so that if they wanna pass a growth levy, then the taxpayers know that's what that's for. And then some districts have income tax levies, we don't. I doubt we ever will, because the business community will shoot it down in front of you. In fact, they actually toyed with that when they started first talking about the preschool promise. So this is our inventory of levies. Do you guys know anything about inside millage versus outside millage?
No.
Okay, so inside millage, the state says that, everybody can go up to 10 mills, right? And then that 10 mills is split across different taxing entities. The districts is 4.19. The libraries might be something else, the county might be something else, but up to 10 mills. Then the outside mills, and those are unvoted, the inside mills. Outside mills are voted, okay? So anything that's an outside mill, the taxpayers have to approve. You can have it as term, emergency levies can go up to 10 years. Ours are typically 5. In northern Ohio, they're almost always continuing, which means you don't have to keep going back to the taxpayers. But for whatever reason, Hamilton County, the southwest part of the state, likes to keep us accountable, so we have to come back and re-ask every 5 years. It's creating a lot of levy fatigue for us, because not only do the taxpayers get tired of them, we're tired of having to go out on the campaign trail all the time. I feel like all I'm doing is working on levies instead of the big job that I have to do. So, back in 1976, they took a whole bunch of levies and combined them together. And so those are all continuing. See all those 1976 ones, there's 3 different millage rates. Then in 83, 87, 95, those are all those current expense where the rates are fixed rates. And these are all last 3 fixed on levies, what they're called emergency levies. Why they use the word emergency, I have no idea, because it's not really an emergency when you're planning for 5 years of expense. I don't know why they came up with that term. But,
Question.
yes,
87.
what's that?
Was there something particular that happened in 87?
That was a big levy. I don't know, it was way before my time. So, yeah, it was a rather large levy at 8 mills.
Yeah.
Was it a recession?
I don't know, I wasn't even living in Cincinnati then.
I was in high school.
I was in high school too.
Yeah. I would assume that there was just a big need, probably an expansion or growth or something that happens that they needed more money than normal.
Well, it also looks like they didn't have a big number for quite a few years, right?
Right.
Like since 76 was the last time they had any.
Well, those 76 ones were a combination, so they started back in the whatevers, the 30s and 40s or whatever, they just combined them all in 76. And why they list them as 3 separate levies, I can't answer that, because,
Right. So then, Jen, you talk about then the
yes.
fact that we have 3 coming, what you're,
Yeah, so typically, emergency levies, like I said, are 5-year, and once they pass in November, they're always a year in arrears, right? So you don't start collecting on it until the following January. So in 2016, this one is starred, that's the preschool levy, because we specifically put on the ballot that we wanted immediate collection. So we passed it in November, and we actually, what the voters said was, you can go ahead and tax us for the last year's property taxes, and we started collecting in January. Typically wouldn't start if you pass it in 16, you wouldn't collect it until January of 18, because the voters approve it in November, and then that next tax year, property taxes hits, because they're billed and collected a year in arrears, we wouldn't collect it for another 14 months. But because we collected early, it's gonna expire early. So we have to just keep in mind that that's coming through. So this 51 million we just passed in November 2017. And so the $65 million, the biggest one that we have, is a 5-year renewal. Originally started in 2010, so we passed it in 14, and this will be the second renewal. The one from 17, the 51 million, already had its 2 renewals. I'm trying to talk the lobbyists into saying, if a levy passes 3 renewals, then automatically make it go continuing. Because if they're gonna keep passing them, why do you keep exhausting everybody? I'm also talking to the board about the possibility of combining levies. They used to be able to combine your levies, they called it a new levy. The new levies that came in after, not Strickland, who came in after Strickland?
Casey should have.
Yeah, Kasich. he passed a law that said if you change your levy, then you lose the rollback and homestead credits, which means the individual taxpayers would have to pay more to get the same value because they don't get those credits anymore. And so we chose not to do that. We didn't want to harm the taxpayers because we're always saying it won't raise your taxes because we're still gonna get our 65 million. But they actually changed that so that if you do take and combine, you just add the millage together, which really freaked our board out because you take this 10.26 and 18.43 and the possibility of convincing people that's not more money, not more taxes to individuals is gonna be really hard to do. But, I just feel like everybody's tired of doing.
So that, just to be clear, that means that there's gonna be levies on the ballot every year,
Yes.
just about.
Yep.
And then, because then once one expires,
Right.
2 years later, it's back on again, just how this is going.
And I actually got a call from the business committee not too long ago because they got wind that I was talking about combining. And they were trying to talk me into waiting, instead of doing this one in November, waiting until March because it's a primary. And they're like, you're more likely to pass if you're gonna do something different and significant in a primary because it's gonna draw people that are more supportive of the district. But then that means I'd have a levy on March and November. One of those will probably fail, right? So it's very delicate.
And since we're asking for it ahead of time, could you do the one in the primaries and then not do the one and then?
No, because remember, this one is gonna expire a year earlier than, so if we don't go this one in November, the funds will stop flowing, and we won't be able to continue to fund preschool expansion.
But that's why you're doing the early, so you have a second.
Yeah, so you have at least a second opportunity, 'cause you just never know what's gonna happen in an election. So.
It's also interesting, like this sheet tells an interesting story. Just like there are chunks of time when like levies never pass.
Yes,
And it makes you think
Yes.
of like,
Yes.
who's the leadership at that time?
right, even what's going, the economics.
The
So
economy.
recently, our renewals have passed in the mid-60s. So we've been very lucky recently for good passage rates, but not every district in Hamilton County is going to be that successful. Okay, so you guys ready to move on to grants? Okay. So, well, now let me go back to the levy. So the role of the board member in a levy cycle is a lot of community council meetings, helping to sell the reason people would support us. Okay, so grant, or we call it soft money, because there's no guarantee that it's gonna continue, so people that put staff and paid for by grants have a risk of not being able to continue that staff member. And there's always pressure about taking those people because they're doing such awesome jobs, get the general fund to pay for it, well, that just makes it really harder to manage the general fund. So we have local grants, and some examples are, we have a GVA aviation grant that helped us fund STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. And then we Celebrate Great Schools is just giving us another big grant for helping our talent development initiative, which is one of our new strategic initiatives in helping raise the skill set of our employees. And then we just recently got a Gates grant supporting 8th grade math. So state grants are very targeted, like the state gives auxiliary. Auxiliary is all of our non-public schools in the city. There's 9,000 students attending non-public schools of our city residents, and there's, I forget how many are non-public, there's probably 80. So that money just passes, we're the fiscal agent, but we don't spend it, it just passes right through to the auxiliary. Public school preschools and other grants, specifically to support public preschool. And vocational education is another state grant. In addition to that, we have our federal grants that are also very targeted. Title I supports disadvantaged students. Title II is class size reduction and improving teacher quality. So if it's about teacher PD or reducing class size, so if we find it in that classroom where we're combining classrooms because they don't have enough resources, we'll put second and third graders in the classroom with one teacher. We'll use that money to add that next teacher to remove that split. Title III is English language learners or limited English proficient students. Adult Ed speaks for itself. DOB supports students with disabilities. It's about $10 million a year. Head Start is for preschool. And the big rule around federal funds is supplement versus supplant rule. So federal funds are supposed to supplement what you're already doing. So if it's part of your core business, it's part of your contractual obligations, it's part of state law, compliance, it has to come out of general fund. You can't supplant what you're paying for in general fund and say, oh, I'm gonna use Title I to pay for this next year, right? So it's always supposed to supplement, and only Title I eligible schools, we have 63 schools, only 7 of them don't qualify because of free reduced lunch rates. So what you do for the Title I schools has to be supplemental, you can't then also go do it with the other 7 schools, right? So they do those tests. Any questions about federal funds? I gave you a list of the ones that we commonly use. Those common funds are always on the front of my treasurer's report, so it helps people understand when we're asking for contracts to be approved, what the funding sources are, and then it matches the purpose of that fund. It's just like a one-page cheat sheet you have in front of you somewhere.
And Jen, you
Yeah.
can use an example of that, because that was one that I think is sometimes hard to understand, what does it mean, supplement, supplant, what kind of thing. And I think one that we've talked about before, because it came before the board a few times, was resource coordinators.
Yes.
That, it's by policy, we need to have, CLCs at every one of our schools, but we can't pay resource coordinators. Go ahead and explain it. Yes, because, go ahead.
Because it's a requirement, it's used for district policy or compliance, then you can't use supplemental funds to do that, because it's not really supplementing anything, it's already a base requirement. So one mistake that people do is one year they'll say, oh, I need, an instructional coach because I have a weakness in math. And they'll use Title I because that's supplemental to what our regular staffing is. But then next year you can't say, oh, I'm gonna use general fund next year, and then you can never go back to federal funds again, because once it's been paid out of the general fund, you can't then replace it and supplant it with Title I. It's very confusing because it's hard.
And with our resource coordinators, I think one of the issues that was coming up was that some schools were wanting to pay for resource coordinators through Title I funds.
Right.
But then we could never pay for resource coordinators at those 7
Right.
schools that were in title
Right.
schools, because they're not title schools, right? And so you just have to be very careful, school by school, but also across the district, about where you're getting your funding from for each of these things.
So our resource coordinators have 3 funding sources. The general fund is the lion's share of that. The Help Foundation and, another grant that I can't think of right now. But not Title I.
Not title.
So, if they pay for the resource coordinators out of supplemental money the first year, then are they expected to just put that in the budget to account for the next year if they need to continue those services?
It depends on why the spend is necessary. So if the board does a resolution that every school has to have a resource coordinator, then no.
Can't use, yes, because that's not supplemental, that's everybody's doing it, so you can't use title funds.
So if you use title funds at a title school to put in resource coordinators, and there's no policy,
I wouldn't call it a resource coordinator. The way we get around something like that is we call it something different. We have a different kind of job description that looks different than what everybody else is doing. So it looks like it's supplemental to what you're already doing.
okay, but if you then put that in other schools, so a, non-community resource coordinator or something. If you did those just in non-Title I schools, then that gets you in trouble too, right?
Well, if a federal auditor comes down and they see that they're doing the exact same job as the other person, then yes, you will get in trouble because they can tell that you're just trying to bypass the rules. So it has to look very different.
Yeah.
We have a really hard time when we buy district-wide curriculum, because then the Title I schools can't use it, and it's so unfair, because if it's really good stuff, then we should be using federal funds to do it. If it's that good, and that important to the district, you should get using operating funds to do it.
Oh, I see, they just love it.
Okay. Okay, we okay to move
Now,
on?
I understand.
Yeah. Okay, so, I already went through the list, but here's the dollar values. We have a $14 million, okay, so the district is on, cash basis. So in corporate accounting, you recognize your revenues and expenses when you earn them or when you incur them. So one example for us would be like transportation. We might transport students in June, but because we're in June 30 fiscal year, and we may not get the invoice until July, I don't recognize that expense until July, because I pay the bill in July. But in corporate world, I incurred that expense in June, so I would recognize it in June. You guys see the difference there? Okay. So that's why I'm talking about receipts, because our grant allocation might be something bigger than that but because we're required to pay the bill and ask for reimbursement, I only recognize it when I pay the bill, but the receipts may always lag behind. That makes sense. Federal grants, last year received about 67 million. See if I want to say anything specific about that. They're not all guaranteed, some of these are competitive. Like Title I is basically we can count on, IDEA B, we basically can count on, but they reduce those values every year. There's two IDEA B, one is for regular, K-12 students, the other one's for preschool disabilities kids. And this might be really small, but we have 900 preschool disability kids. Any questions about any of those? Okay, ready to move on to state funding? Yes.
Are we able to put any, like, so if we don't use the money, are we able to put it away in a rainy day fund or something like that?
Good question, great question, actually. And it depends on the grant. Some grants will allow you to carry over, and some won't. So, some of the big ones like Title I, the federal grants will allow us to carry over, so we have to get all of our stuff, the funds have to be encumbered by the end of the year, by June 30. We have to pay out the bill by September 30, or we have to send the money back, or we have to ask for it to be carried over. Sometimes they're nice about it, and sometimes they're not. But
Wouldn't there be penalty, working in other grant spaces, if you don't actually spend the money, then it can
you're less likely to
impact
get
the-
that grant next year,
Right, I
right?
was gonna
Because
say.
you get the grant because you have a purpose for doing it, right?
Mhm.
And so you're supposed to spend the money on the
It's not
students
good
in
not
the
to
year
spend
that
it.
you have it. But sometimes they're so far behind, we don't get the grant allocation until like May, and then how are you gonna spend it up by June?
Spin down.
Spend it down, yes. Yeah.
But that question, it goes even beyond like grants. So with any
Yeah.
type of source funding, whatever it is, if we find a way to cost save something, just so we can put a little bit aside, like, do we have any of
We do that same rules apply, your expenses, the money that you have, the revenue you have are supposed to match the year that you spent on the students. So, on a rare occasion, we will transfer money out of the general fund and put it in like in a permanent improvement fund for that purpose. And we did that when we, were redesigning the data center, because when we moved into the building in 1988, 89, I believe. No, I'm sorry, back up. 95 or 96. That data center is down in the basement that houses all the network equipment, all that kind of stuff, had not been renovated since then. We started planning for that back when I was still the CIO, so 5-6 years ago. And then so we just started putting money into that permanent improvement fund until we had enough to fund it. So we don't wanna go back to the taxpayers to say, please pass a levy for $2 million, you know. So it was a good question, but typically not. Okay, so the difficulty about state foundation formula is that the rules change every 2 years on the state biennial budget. So it's really hard to, and I'm required to do a 5-year cash forecast twice a year. It's really hard to predict anything outside that funding formula because you just never know what the lobbyist group are gonna change to. So it's all kind of an educated guess. But it's based on average daily membership. That does not mean enrollment, it means students enrolled plus excused absences. So our absence tracking is fairly important. Students that reside in the district, and it's based on the weighting of the conditions of the students. For example, we have a base rate of, I forget what year it is, 59, it's more than that, but, then if they have a disability, they get extra weighting, if it's specific kinds of disability, and, in here, you know, I get to see all that stuff. So, English language learners, voc ed students, they all get different weightings, right? So they get weighted based on the conditions of the students. Then, they take that formula and they reduce it by our state share. Our percent is 47%. So what the state says is, because we are a wealthy district, and we'll go into why they say we're a wealthy district in a minute, based on property values, because we can pass more levies than the rural districts or the other kinds of districts, they reduce our ability, because they say we have more ability to raise local funds than other districts do, so they're gonna give us less money. It's been ruled unconstitutional 4 times and nobody's been able to figure it out. Then, after they do that, they reduce the state share, they start taking money away from us based on all the tuition that they pass pass laws on. I'll go into all these details in just a second. Okay, so we are a district that's thankfully growing. But there's also rules in the formula that prevent anybody from declining too quickly or growing too quickly. If you're declining too quickly, then you can't pay your bills. If you're growing too quickly, then they have to figure out a way to balance those funds out, right? So the rule is 3%. So because we are growing, but we're not growing beyond 3%, what the formula will cap it'll take 3% of last year's revenues, and that's as much as we can grow, is 3% more, right? Regardless of what our kids do. Same thing on the other end. If we're dropping, they'll only allow us, they call that the guarantee, down to like 97% of the previous year's revenues. So we can't drop too fast, we can't grow too fast.
So even if we get more than 3% more kids in our district, we don't get more money for them.
Okay.
Right, I'm like, and pause.
So
Let's
then it's
so
like,
understand
so
what
let's
that
say
means.
we're
Yes.
6%
Stop
in year
moving
one.
here.
Yes.
We get 3% year one, and we'll definitely get 3% year two to cumulatively carry the 6%.
Because year to year. So if you grow really big in one year, you don't get that credit in the next year. No, it's not cumulative.
Okay.
It's making me think about the relationship between public schools and just sort of like urban growth planning, right? Because I mean, literally, if it does happen too fast, like.
Am I moving out? I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, that's okay, I'm moving
It
this, thank you.
completely impacts the city's ability to accommodate.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, is that happening? Like in terms of city expansion and sort of urban planners, are they in conversation with schools about like, you know, cause I just read an article about how Cincinnati's growing and
Right.
it's more than 3%
Enrollment, right.
actually. So I'm like, oh, is that point whatever percent not gonna get accommodated in terms of students? And like, so are those conversations happening?
Sort of. Not as much as we would like,
Right.
but they're starting. Now, so let me just or comment on something you said. We are growing more than 3%, but preschool or regular preschool is not counted in the funding formula. So the funding formula is only K-12 plus preschool disabilities. The state does not fund preschool. Okay? So there's always that nuance about whenever we're talking about enrollment, are we talking about head count? Are we talking about membership? Are we talking about preschool, K-12, what is it? So it's always nice to know that.
So so do kids coming from charters and parochial schools and private schools and everything coming into the district affect that 3%?
No.
So it's population,
Well, yes, it does, because, it's the kids that are reported through the state funding, so not, kids who pay tuition in our publics, no, but if they're voucher kids because they're using state funds, then yes, and charter school kids because they're using state funds. So it's our funded ADM, but it's 3% of the dollar value, not necessarily of the kids.
okay.
So the dollar value is driven by the number of kids and the conditions of the kids, but they only look at the revenues when they calculate the 3% cap. And sometimes over years, it used to be 7.5% cap, then it was 5, now it's 3, so they change it to help themselves. Okay, so, state funding formula. You have all these different line items. The opportunity grant is that base funding times all the kids that we have in our weightings. Targeted assistance, K-3 literacy, economic disadvantage. Remember when I talked about restricted funds? The economic disadvantage at 21 million and the voc ed career tech funding is restricted. Everything else is unrestricted. So according to the state, our funding formula, we get a little bit for our third grade guarantee and a little bit for our graduation. Not much. It's kind of a pittance. To use Mary Roman's terms. So all that, we funded for 43,382.81 students. Okay? And this changes every month and will continue to change until February as our state reporting team, it's called EMIS, cleans up data. Because if there's an error in a student record, they'll pull it out for funding until we fix the error. Like, I'll just give you a simple example. When I was enrolling my children in elementary school, I accidentally wrote my birth year down instead of theirs, and that would reject that kid for funding. Okay, because I'm too old to be in kindergarten. anyway, so those 43,000 students generate 197 million funding. That's big, it's that state share reduced. And then we get the additional funding for special ed and transportation. So we have a calculated funding of 202 million to fund those 43,000 students, and an average of $4,662 per child. We spend about $13,000 per kid, right? Because we're taking a local share and our federal grants and stuff like that. So then they start deducting. So there's 12,000 students that live in our district that attend non-CPS schools that are part of their funding. So the voucher, charter, autism, Peterson scholarship students. So they're deducting 80 million. That's an average of 6,500. So we're taking in 4,600 per kid, but they're deducting 6,500. That's the whole argument of them taking the local share with them. Does that make sense? Okay. Then we have 600 kids that actually from other districts that come to us. So we get another 3.5 million in revenue from that. And then we end up with a net of 31,000 students to fund and an average of $4,000 per child. This is going to become more significant here. So I'm giving you the breakdown of all the deductions. Now the $80 million reduction of tuition, they just take right off the top. The charter school students, they're 6,500. They get the full base rate plus the student weighting, and that's not reduced by the state share because they don't get our local taxes. The local taxes come to us. The voters approved Cincinnati Public School to get that money. So they're deducting the $7,400 for each student. So that's the huge argument out there. Ed vouchers is the non-public, and that once a child gets a voucher, they can have it until they graduate. So it's a 13-year agreement unless they leave on their own or get kicked out. Peterson and autism, they're very expensive. There's expensive students to educate. The rule says it's a max of 27,000. So they either get the tuition that's charged for those children, or up to a maximum of 27,000 per child per year. And then we have, because we're open enrollment district, we have some kids that actually go to other districts. We lose a lot of kids to Laughlin. Excuse me. And so they're deducting the 12,000 students and an average of 6,500. And so I'm just showing you the different values. So one might ask, why is that difficult? Well, it's difficult to predict charter schools because they open and close constantly. Plus, when you talk to our teachers, you'll hear kids that leave us to go to charter schools and then come back a couple years later, they fall further behind. But then we're accountable to their test scores that they're in next year. So it takes us a while to get them caught back up.
On that note, when I was working in schools, there was a thing about like there's a day that there's a count or something, and so like the funding comes based off of this day, and so all of the children who were in charter schools would be at charter schools, and then after that day, they would come back to CPS, so we didn't have the amount of funding,
Right.
or something of that nature.
So they've changed those rules over the years as they figured how people mess with the system. Okay. So we used to have the first full week in October where we were funded. So everybody had a count for 5 full days. And then it was proportionate, and that's what we got for the year. Then they started, but the charter schools got monthly, right? So if we didn't catch them in October and they started deducting, we were losing money on the deal in a big way. So now they do it twice a month. The thing about the accountability, what you were talking about, is you have to be enrolled for 100 days in order for your test scores to count. So if you've only been enrolled in the district for 90 days, you don't count that year, but maybe the next year. So that's when people flip back and forth between. Like, there's an incentive to get rid of the kids that on the 99th day, if you don't think they're gonna do well on the test. Right?
Wow.
It's not about the kids.
And then if they leave the charter, when they leave CPS, they take that 7,300.
The money just stops flowing. So if they leave in February, they won't get the full year. Those are full year rates.
Okay.
The money just stops flowing if we catch it.
So we will get their money?
Well,
We will
if they
get
come
the
back to
difference?
us, so there's a system, the state student identifier that tracks, they're not allowed to have individual student information, they could just have a state ID. So if that state ID shows up in another district, they look at the beginning and ending, and entering a withdrawal dates of that kid, and then they'll calculate the number of days of funding each entity gets.
Okay.
It's very
So we do
complicated.
get
charter schools that will fill out documents on parents and they'll put in an address that's in the district, but it's an empty lot. Right, so we're only allowed to challenge addresses that are outside the district, because we were actually challenging all those to prevent funding, and, they complained and they came down and yelled at me. So we lost that ability, but, so now you only have X amount of days. If you don't get that challenge in the first, I think it's 30 days, you're stuck paying that kid all year long, even though you can prove, like, on the 31st day that it was wrong. They won't do it. Is there another question?
I think you just answered.
Okay.
The whole idea of the money follows the child, and that was always a bone of contention with me about, you know, the charters and non-publics getting our money, but then when they're sending them back to us, is that money still following them? Anything left over?
It just flows into, it'll follow them to where they show up. So they go to, every time a charter school closes, half the kids go to another charter school and half of them come back to CPS typically. So it just depends on how good everybody is at keeping records. What else did I want to say? Oh, in addition to the $55 million that we spend on charter school tuition, we're also spending $7 million on transporting all those kids. And that includes a voucher and the non-public kids too, so don't let it mislead you, but it's very expensive. So, and because I'm like a total data geek, I'm trying to give you some comparative data. I did this in October and I haven't updated it. The data I showed you before was we get paid from the state twice a month. So there's like a number 1 payment, a number 2 payment. The data before I gave you was November, so this data won't match what's on the previous slides, I'm just letting you know that. But CPS, Cleveland, Columbus, and Dayton, our state shares, we're at 47, almost 48%. Dayton and Cleveland, our student populations are basically the same, but their state share is so much higher, and it's because our property values are so much higher.
So I just want to clarify that too, just to make, put an exclamation point on that. So when they talk about us being a wealthy district, they're not talking about the comparative wealth of our students and our families. They're talking about property, how much do we get in property?
And city residential wealth,
Right.
income, and not just our not just our parents, but the city. And I'm gonna go through that formula, it's crazy.
So while we might have one of the highest child poverty rates in the country, we're considered a wealthy district. And that's why only that 47.9%
Yeah.
comes from the state, and that's why we have all of these levies that we're constantly having to make up the rest of the funding.
But at the same time, we have the highest market share. So when I calculated market share, I just said, here's our funded kids, these are the ones that go elsewhere, these are the ones we get to keep. And that, we have 73% of that market share. Now, if you look at Sarah's enrollment presentation, the market share will be different, because she's including preschool kids in that, I'm not. Question?
Yeah, so when they're calculating property values, it's assessed property values, but it doesn't take into account the millions that we have made, right?
Next slide.
Good transition, David.
Perfect, you have a paper.
I try and help.
So this is a state share formula, and it's all in this little blue document here, if you felt like reading it sometime when you can't sleep. So it comes up with all these different indexes. The valuation index looks at the assessed value of tax years 14, 15, and 16, it's a 3-year average, right? We're almost into 19, so they're behind. And it's an adjusted property value, so they take your assessed value plus your abated plus your exempt values to come up with your 3-year average. But then there's some weird formula that says if your abated value is greater than X%, then it doesn't get included in, I don't know. But so I'm showing you the math. So it's a 3-year average comparison of Cincinnati district versus the state average. And so as we change, that index will fluctuate. So our per pupil property value is $137,000 per student. The state average is $145, so our index is 0.941. Okay, that's just one item. Then they look at your median index, median income, tax year 15, why they can't use something more recent, who knows, compared to the state. So our median income in 15 was $30,813. The state was $33,782, yes.
Is that the median income of, Cincinnati residents? Or
Yes,
like,
all,
people who work
they
in
look at tax
Cincinnati?
returns of all the city residents.
Okay.
The city residents or the district residents?
city.
Okay.
Wow.
So our index is 0.912. Then they calculate the income index, so it's 50% of your median index plus an average of your federally adjusted gross income. You know, that line 41 on your tax form. And then divide it, and do a per pupil value of that and then compare it to the state. So we are 50% of 0.912 plus the 193, which is our federally adjusted three-year average of federally adjusted gross income divided by the states, and our value our index is 0.9787. Okay, so then they come up with a wealth index that says if your income index is less than your valuation index and your median index is less than 1.5 or equal to, then your income index is 40% plus your valuation index times 60%. Otherwise, it's just your valuation index. So our wealth index, so that calculation is greater than our valuation index, so then our wealth index is our valuation index, and that's 0.941. So then, they have this little thing. If your wealth index is less than 35%, then your state share is 90%. So, if you're low wealth, you get more state share. If your wealth index is greater than 1.8, so a really wealthy district, then you'll get 5. Like, they think probably Wyoming probably gets 5, or Indian Hill. But then if you're in between, then you have this other convoluted formula, and that's how you come up with our 47%. Understand?
I mean, it's,
I live this stuff, and I have to keep reminding myself what the formulas are. It's hard to grasp.
I mean, I think, I don't know if David, like, is there a reason why you're not just looking at CPS?
That would be a question for the state, the Ohio Department of Education.
Cause I mean, like, in a city like Cincinnati, that's gonna skew what
Yeah.
that stuff is greatly, which is part of the problem.
Right. That's why they say it's unconstitutional.
And so Jen, one of the questions that came from somebody that just came a little late, so I sent over to you, was, when we talk about the state's funding formula, we say they, like they created this, who is the they? Is it our state reps? Is it the Department of Ed? Who votes on this? Who makes the changes to this? Because one of the things this group is trying to figure out is like, if I wanna make an impact, what should I run for? And like, is there some other position I could run for that controls this?
That's a great question. The governor does the biennium budget, so he has a lot of influence. The legislators vote on all the laws that feed into this stuff.
Okay.
And the Ohio Department of Education has a lot of decision-making in it too, so, it's all the above.
Okay.
I don't know that there's any one source.
So who has standing to challenge the unconstitutionality of the funding model?
I'm sorry, who's
Who
asking?
has standing?
The state legislator. It's gone to the state supreme, it's gone all the way to the US Supreme Court.
Right?
I actually had to present on that case in my school law class, because I was the only accountant in the room.
So why aren't the legislatures held in contempt of court and thrown in federal
I
prison?
don't know. That's a good question, actually. Why is it changed?
They keep trying to create bodies to come up with something better. Every time they come up with a new formula, all the lobbying groups from all the different types of districts complain that they're being harmed too much, so they try to jerry-rig it to, that's how they came up with the guarantee and the cap, right? Because some people would be hurt too much. The district, our rural districts don't have any property wealth, and so they have a lot of difficulty. They used to have a modification of funding formula back when I was assistant treasurer that was a cost of doing business factor, and that helped, but that went away, I don't know, somewhere between 2004 and 2015.
No, it's, I don't know, it just seems like it would be more equitable to create some kind of disaggregated system so that you're not comparing rural districts to urban districts or suburban. I mean, it's just, they're like apples and oranges.
Agreed.
So if this group wanted, if folks in this group wanted to do something, I think the question is like, who do you even call? Who do you lobby? Who do you say this is important to us down in Cincinnati? State rep, take this on, or like, what do you even do about it?
I would go to state rep, so, we have our lobbyist group, Eric Kearney and George Glover, and they go and do all of our lobbying for us. And a lot of times we'll chart is, all it does is show that market share of enrollment. Just go right back. Okay, now we're gonna switch to expenditures. Everybody change topics? Spending money. Yeah, so you've probably never heard of what we call, so the district, if you become a board member, get used to acronyms because we use acronyms for everything. USAS, this stands for the Universal State Accounting System. And so every district, all 613 districts in Ohio use the same general ledger funds, or general ledger code structure. It's in 10 segments, very complicated. It's broken down to determine what fund are we spending the money from, what's the function, in other words, is it elementary instruction, is it high school instruction, is it extracurricular, is it special ed? The object is the what, so is it salaries, travel, mileage, supplies, okay? Then we have this special cost center that we have control over, so the V we use for our spend against Vision 2020, so the board says, how much money we spent on Vision 2020, I could very easily go grab it. Subject, isn't being used right now, but I think the state is going to start tying academic performance to spend. So they're trying to come up with a way to determine return on investment out in the corporate world. So soon, I predict within the next 3 to 5 years, our state report card is gonna show, well, here's your third grade guarantee results, this is the money you spent on third grade guarantee. So they're gonna wanna know, or how much did you spend on algebra? Or what were your Common Core exams, right? So we have the ability to track how much money are we spending on each subject that we teach. The complexity becomes, if I'm a teacher and I teach 2 bills of algebra, 2 bills of geometry, and then earth science, I have to split that salary 5 different ways. And we have teachers that kind of bop all over the place, so it's really hard to keep track of.
How do you do that with building and transportation expenses then? Right, because you've got fixed overhead for the building.
Right. So that's a good point. So on the state report card right now, it shows that we're 15th out of 15 on classroom spending, which is just because of the way we budget and control our spend. What they do is if it's a centralized expense, they'll just cost allocate it evenly across the district. But when we have the ability to cost allocate it, when I'm working with our senior leaders about is when they have a curricular digital software contract, $1 million. If they know that is for basically third grade, or if it's regular ed versus special ed, then I can proportionally allocate it out. I just need to know what it's for.
Right, I mean, for curriculum, I mean, that's easy, right?
Well, we can do that with transportation, because we know who we're transporting. We know what grade they're at. We know whether they're regular ed or special ed.
But, I mean, if you look at the high school, right, where not everybody takes every class, and you've got,
Right.
you know,
That's why nobody's
100
ever
different
taken this
classes,
challenge.
right? Okay.
I tried to talk Mary Ronan into it when I first became treasurer. She was like, oh, no, Jen, we're not doing that. Okay, because, so we have trouble just keeping track of, on the function code, we have special education teachers, not just a special education teacher. We have self-contained versus inclusion teacher. They're 2 different functions. So every year, those people move in and out of those functions all the time, but they always, the schools forget to tell us. So we need a better way to track that. And we're getting better at it now that we have a new system, but moving on, OPU is the operating unit, so that is the school or the department. So school 105 is Bond Hill, okay, school 407 is Aiken, so they're all numerically coded. We also have the ability to check instructional level, but when I ask the board, I'm like, well, how do I handle a Montessori classroom where there's 3 ages in one classroom? And they're like, we don't know. So thank you. And that's only numeric, so I can't even use like an M for Montessori. So we don't do that. And then the budget unit is not required by the state, but it's something that we use because we will budget things centrally and then spend it out in the schools. So for this example I'm giving you, 598 is with school-wide pool, and I'll go into that in a minute. It's a different fund. 110 is elementary instruction. 511 is classroom supplies. It's for Vision 2020. It's at Bond Hill, but it was budgeted by the technology department. So it's probably some kind of software. Okay, does that make sense? It's very complicated, but it took a long time to teach people how to use these numbers correctly. So, this chart shows you the object, so the what we spend, not necessarily the function between regular instruction or special ed or high school or whatever. because you would think that 80%, because mostly we're about teachers, right? You would think that our spend would be salary and benefits, but we outsource all of our busing. So those are contracted services, not salaries. So that's the purchase services. So purchase services, that light blue purple chunk is all of our transportation, all the tuition, all of the instructional supplies, what else is in there? All professional services, so we outsource a lot of our technology support. That's all in there. We have debt, so we have a lot of things called transfers, so that means we're just moving money from a budget from one fund to another. So we pay our debt out of a different fund than our operating fund. We move money from the operating funds or from whatever other source into the debt fund to pay that bill out. Even our payroll taxes, federal income, state income taxes, we withhold it out of whatever fund they were paying that salary out of. We transfer the money into a withholding fund, and then we pay our taxes out of that fund. Our general fund, I'm giving you, that was a lot of funds, right, the major funds. Now I'm just giving you general funds. So last year's budget was $632 million. This part is very confusing, the school-wide pool transfer. And it's hard to figure out what we're spending our money on because of that transfer. So we're taking a big chunk of general fund money and we're putting it into another fund. So back in 2003, the federal law, No Child Left Behind, changed and allowed us to commingle our funds. We didn't used to be able to do that. So one school might have to manage 5 different budgets if they had 5 different sources of funds. Because they passed that law and the board passed a resolution, we're allowed to commingle. So we commingle our general fund, our Title I and our Title II monies into one fund, so the principal has to manage one budget. But they have to follow it at the title plan, so that the money has to be spent to support the needs of the students, and they have to be able to track that. We used to put IDEA in there, students, the fund that supports students with disabilities, but we had a lot of compliance issues because principals would forget, or schools would forget that that money was supposed to be spent on students with disabilities. The funds, the beauty of this is once the funds enter that 598 fund, the school-wide pool, it loses its identity. So you can spend it however you need it to spend, as long as you're spending it on your plan. And then when it comes, when we pay the bill and charge back the fund, it gets for every dollar we spend, it's proportionally charged back to the fund it came from. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I actually have a graphic here. I should have looked too fast. So this is really confusing. It's really hard to forecast and for the public to understand because it's always this big chunk in the general fund and we only forecast the general fund. So I'm trying to come up with a consolidated budget and a funding source that we do it comprehensively so that makes more sense. Steve complains about this all the time. But in the years that before we did the pool, to the years that we are in the pool, we're leaving less money on the table in each of those funds, so we're spending it more efficiently. Does that make sense? Even though it's harder in the accounting department, it's better for academics. Okay, so here's a chart that I'm showing you. So it's by kind of like where the money is spent instead of what we're spending it on. Because of that report card makes it look like we're not spending our money in the classroom, it's spent on administrative kind of stuff. You can see that basically 84% of all the money that we spend is spent directly on students. So it's either in schools, in student supports, which means it's school social workers, psychologists, intervention specialists, audiologists, occupational therapists. And then I also included all the tuition because the tuition that we pay out goes directly to support students, right? So that's part of this 15% of state deductions, all that tuition money that comes out. And then district fixed fees are things like the debt that we pay, the money we pay the Hamilton County auditor, so he'll collect our taxes and then give them to us. It's $4 million a year. This graph shows the relationship between our cash and our levies and what happens if we don't pass a levy. So the purple line at the top shows our revenues, assuming that our renewals pass. Right? So it stays pretty flat. The expenditures go up, but that's just a condition of forecasting. So if you assume inflation, you're just going to assume that things continue to go. But because we control our spend through budgets and appropriations, we have the ability to change that curve. So we never spend above our resources. Right? By state law, I cannot go into a cash deficit. The little man upstairs in Oak
16, 17, and 18, you don't track what your budgeted number was to show?
On this particular chart, no, but I can.
Because it would just be interesting to see that, because then you could get a feel for,
Mhm.
are we really just losing money every,
Right, so that's gonna segue into the whole financial efficiency study, so remind me of that when I get there,
Fair
okay?
enough.
So the blue line at the top shows you what happens to our revenues if we don't pass those renewals, and then what's resulting in our cash balance. So we always forecast out, further out, that we're gonna be in a cash deficit, so it tells us we need to change, either we're gonna change our spending, so we stay within our budget, or we go out for new money. So it's just informing us. The forecast says if nothing else changes, we continue, inflation continues the way it is, we keep spending the way we are, this is what it's gonna look like. It doesn't mean that's all that's gonna happen because we're responsible and we never let that happen, but it just helps us to plan our, exercises. Does that make sense to everybody? So, to get to your point, I think it's my next slide, yeah. So, when I first became the treasurer, I was the interim treasurer, because I kind of went in there kicking my feet. I was having so much fun being the CIO. The business community came to me and they said, Jen, because we were talking about going for new money. They were talking about the preschool expansion. We were talking about going for new money. We hadn't had new money since 2008. We were being fiscally responsible because of our strategic initiatives and yada, yada, yada. We needed more money to keep moving. And they said, people always say that you're crying wolf because your forecast always looks so ugly, but you always come in under budget. And I said, because it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we think we're gonna overspend, we stop spending, right? We quit letting people, we delay things or whatever. But it's also that forecasting, ability that if you don't know, there's no treasurer in the world that wants to under forecast because I don't wanna be the treasurer that says, oh yeah, we'll be fine, we don't need any more money, and then suddenly we're like, oops, we overspent by $20 million, right? So I tend to be very conservative in my forecasting, but there's a criticism that says we do it purposely to scare the public into passing levies, and that's not true. But, so they said, would you be willing to let us come in and look at your books? And I'm like, well, I'm the interim treasurer, well, let's come on in. I don't have anything to hide. So they did, so they created the CBC and the CRBC. CBC is the top 25, I think, corporations in Cincinnati, and the regional, CRBC is the regional group, the smaller group. But they financed this study. They did I made them do an RFP so that it was competitively bid, right? And they picked, and I was part of that team, so we picked Parthenon, which is a subdivision of Ernst & Young, very highly respected accounting firm. Parthenon does a whole bunch of consulting, efficiency studies, and that kind of stuff. And they came down and spent 12 weeks with me, and I used to call it root canal because they spent an ungodly amount of time with me, but it was really good in the end. So they went through and looked at 5 years of all of our revenue, all of our expenditures. They just dug into everything. And what they were trying to answer was, are we spending our money wisely? Are we being good stewards of our money? Are we forecasting appropriately? Do we really need new money? Because on the other ear, the preschool promise people were saying, oh, they don't need money. We need the levy because they didn't want to do an income tax. They didn't want to do an earnings tax, right? So they were like, Cincinnati doesn't need the money. The preschool people need the money. So we have this competitive nature here. And then CBC is like, well, who do we support, right? So they came up with, and what they heard was, you guys were already doing all the ideas, cost controlling, all the stuff that we're coming up with. But they did come up with some recommendations. The first being transportation was to double route our buses, which we had already done. The ones we couldn't do is because non-public schools wouldn't cooperate with us on their start times. But as the shortage of bus drivers nationally has made that more challenging, they're being more cooperative because their buses are late too. So we continued some more. We even went further with that when we went to Metro and said, quit going down all the little neighborhoods, just down the main streets, and we saved like a ton of money doing that. Then they said, well, you can strategically rebid all your contracts, with the city nursing contract, like who can supply city nurses? Like, there's not a lot. Who can supply high school busing? Nobody but Metro. But there's other contracts that we can control, so we can control how much that contract is gonna be for, but we just have to live with the results of that, right? We have to spend less and do with less service. But, so we did, we actually, rebid a lot of our medical contracts, and we were able to save money. Then they said, well, you guys way we handle classroom overload. So the collective bargaining agreement says that we staff a K-3 classroom is up to 18. When you get that 19th child in that classroom, you put a paraprofessional in it. No other district does this stuff. So they're saying, well, that's too expensive. Change that ratio and you'll get to save money, but that had to be negotiated in the contract. So we couldn't just do it. They also said that our medical benefits were extremely rich compared to the corporate world. And it is, we have a good benefit plan, but we are making inroads on that every time we renegotiate. We rebid our Humana, we used to be with Humana for 10 years probably, now we're on Anthem, we actually saved, we did, our medical costs, we're self-insured, medical costs are still going up, they're just not going up at the same rate they were predicted to go up. Teachers, they said same thing on the class size, change that ratio so you don't add, a K-3 class is up to 20, so 18, the 19th kid, you put a paraprofessional in there, the 26th kid, you put a new teacher and split that classroom into two classrooms. They're saying, well, just make it higher. What they say, add one teacher, make it 27 or 26. And our negotiations in the collective bargaining agreement weren't successful. And quite frankly, our board wasn't necessarily, or our superintendent wasn't successful because that's what's driving our academics higher than all those other districts that don't do this, right? So academically, we didn't believe in that. And it was beauty to watch Mary talk to the CBCers about that, about how we're gonna do that to the poor families and, you can't just do this stuff. And she's wonderful to watch. And then they said, because we were spending a lot of money on My Tomorrow and technology moving forward, they're saying, we'll just reduce the scope of that or slow the growth down. And actually, when we introduced My Tomorrow to the board the first time, we had a 5-year rollout plan. Right, we did 7th and 8th grade the first year, then 9th, 10th was gonna be the second year, 11th, 12th was gonna be the third year, and then we're gonna go down to 5, 6. Well, after the first year, all the high school people were like, we want it now. So we went 7, 8, 9, 12. And now we're down to 3rd grade. So, it went like that, spending, but we're doing okay. So we do have the ability to control our strategic initiatives, but we don't want to because that's what's helping to drive our growth. It's to attracting people back to the district and increasing our academics. So this is a scorecard. They monitor our success in that. They've kind of quit bugging me about it because it's so far out now. But I do go down and visit with them like at least twice a year. Feeling the whole accountable. How are we doing on time?
About 5:20.
Sorry, I'm leaving early.
That's okay.
I'm
No
leaving
worries.
at like
No worries.
Eastern.
Not at all.
Although I am.
I'm telling you, this is stuff that's crammed in. Okay, so now we're gonna convert to budget. So the role of the board is to set the strategic direction. It's the role of the administration to actually develop the budget. The board sets the direction and approves the budget, but they don't help develop the budget. And so sometimes we have board members who are a little bit more micromanaging than the others. Not the one in the room, totally good. People are just very passionate about it. But, yeah, the board hires professionals to do jobs and, so. Anyway, so I created this slide for our brand new board members that came on this year so that they would know going in what their role was. Yeah, so that was good. So the board sets the strategic goals and approves the budget. The superintendent, so there's also, a little snarky comment that was like, it's not the treasurer's budget, it's the superintendent's budget. It is. The superintendent's the CEO, but it's my responsibility to build the budget process, monitor, and maintain compliance, right? So we are partners in every step of the way. So then the schools, we're gonna go through some of how they're built, and then, the performance leadership team actually sets the annual scope of the budget. So on our multi-year initiatives like My Tomorrow, we decide, well, we're gonna go 3rd grade this year, or we're not gonna do 3rd grade this year, we're gonna do this. So that, what we do is we take that, I set the budget target based on the 5-year forecast. We scope out our strategic initiatives, and we set that money aside right off the top. Because we wanna continue to focus, and those are the things that are so easy to cut out of the budget. And so I make them do that first. And then we do everything else. And then the central office people, they get what's left. And they're not real happy about doing that, but it's what it is. So we have a budget commission. I call it Noah's Ark because there's like 2 of everything on it. We meet with them on a regular basis, and they help us make decisions along the way. And in fact, if I were a board member wannabe, that might be something you'd get involved in. Because it'd be a good way to like get into the guts of stuff. we're required to do a bunch of public hearings based on our board. So this is kind of the timeline. We actually started way early this year, because last year the budget cycle was a total disaster. 2 of us lost parents in the middle of the cycle, and we lost a payroll clerk in the middle of the cycle, like with a 6-week period. It was hard to get anything done, and so we broke all of our deadlines and everything. So I made a commitment to our principals that they'll have their first level of staffing in November, and they'll get their first draft of the budget in December. So anybody that sits on LSDMC, you should be hearing things already. So it starts in October, with the board did the retreat, they came up with their new strategic initiatives. Sarah Travolver does the student projections, and that's what's used to drive the whole budget for the next year. I did those for 20 years, and I taught her how to do it, I'm so proud of her. And then the budget commission is meeting December Friday, and then they'll meet monthly to help us stay on task. So the board strategies that they came up with in our October retreat, so they used to have the good people, the good systems, the good, they still do that, but what they want to focus on, excuse me, are student-centric decision-making, strategic planning, growth, community engagement, creating better systems. Let me go back to growth. So it's not just enrollment growth, because we are, right as we speak, renovating 3 preschool classrooms to open in January, because we are squished on the west side of town. So we're having 2 classrooms renovated at Aiken High School, but at Silver Park, and they'll open up in January. Excuse me. But we're talking about enrollment growth, facility growth, and employee growth. Remember that talent development initiative that we started a couple years ago? We're spending a lot of time trying to rebrand ourselves, making sure that everybody has a certain level skill set at each salary classification. And so we're going through a lot of professional development. The leadership team right now is doing a lot of team building stuff right now. It's really cool. So it's not just whatever lens people think growth is. Creating better systems, and safety and security is huge because of the culture of the nation, right? And all that's done through a lens of equity. So the board passed an equity resolution like 3 years ago. Everything we do, we talk about, is this equitable? So I totally redesigned the school budget based on that equitable conversation, because as we were reviewing all the staffing formulas with principals, what I was hearing from them is the formula it's equal, but it's not equitable. So the principal at South Avondale, Mike Allison, said, my school is very different than Michelle Kipps at Leap, thank you. I wanted to say Cheviot, but I knew that was right. Or Angel Roddy was on my team from Mount Airy. He said that all those schools are so different. He goes, I have different needs than they do. And I said, well, that's great, but help me come up with a formula to fund that. Right, so they wanted different weightings for them, and they talked about getting data from the pyramids of intervention, which is about behaviors, and social emotional learning. And how make it take me 5 years to come up with a formula that everybody agreed to, right? So what we decided to do was say, okay, we're just gonna give you the base formula that's contractual or legal, and then you tell us what your equity ask is. And so that's what they're doing right now. They got their base formula on November 16th, all their staffing based on the projections. They're, by Friday, are supposed to submit a form to us saying, this is my equity ask, and they have to substantiate it with data. So if they want more school social worker time, they need to show that they have this attendance problem, or they need an extra security assistant because of whatever's going on, right? So this is the first time we're doing this. I'm really nervous because I have a feeling it's gonna be $8 billion. So yesterday we went through a process on how we want to evaluate those equity asks and how we're gonna create priorities, and we created it with this decision matrix that we're gonna follow, and so we'll see how that goes.
So can I ask you a question then?
Yes.
So we got a lot of people on LSDMCs in this room. Is the equity asks and coming up with what those are, is that something principals should be talking with their ILT and LSDMCs about? If it's due Friday? I'm curious if people in the room who are on LSDMCs know about this equity ask and what's been happening.
We have an emergency meeting tomorrow.
You have an emergency meeting
Are you
tomorrow?
Are you LSDMC?
Yeah.
Okay, so more than likely they spent, because this is new, and I told them, I said, get your meetings scheduled, because this is the timeline, so I've been meeting with them,
Yeah.
the principals on time, and it's always hard to do this around the holidays, but, so mostly they're focusing on what their ILTs probably do right now.
Okay.
The so the ILT helps develop the budget, the LSD improves the budget.
Got it.
So they may not get into some may, some not, every school's different, but for the most part, it would be the ILT at this point.
So this is really
are several, we also, in addition to their base, we also came up with what we said were non-negotiables, right? So this listed over here, so the state law changes here that says you can't put out kindergartners for its suspension, you can't do that anymore. And so we made a rule that, every elementary school will have, every K-6 will have one in-school suspension paraprofessional, because it used to be the school decided what they wanted or not. We used to give them a civil service allocation based on the number of students they had, and they got to decide on security or ISS or reading para or another teacher or whatever. And now we're saying, no, because of this state law, this has to be in your building. So every K-6 gets one, every K-8 gets two, because you don't want the 7th and 8th graders in with kindergartners. Every K-12 gets 3, and every 7-12 gets 2. The security staff, instead of trying to figure out a formula, because there is no one based on number of students, it's most on the shape of the building. Some buildings have multiple floors and pavilion doors, and some don't. So they actually, a team of police officers and our security group and our assistant superintendents went and visited. They determined how many security assistants are needed for each building, and so we funded that. And then the resource coordinators, we talked about already, and it's supposed to say reading specialist.
Do you need a reading specialist?
I do. And I have no idea where that orange line came from, because it wasn't in part of our normal thing. I don't know. But, so we do the base and the non-negotiables, and then, the school-based equity allocations as right now. While we're doing all the non-personnel stuff that we're loading into the budget, we're actually using a new budget tool this year on OpenGov. So if you've been on OpenGov on our financial transparent page, there's a budget module that we're building, because we were doing it on Excel spreadsheets, and that's a nightmare.
Yeah.
It's just an absolute nightmare. I can't do any analytics on it, right? When you have 100 different spreadsheets. So OpenGov, I'll be able to say, oh, this is how much money we spend on copy clicks per student, or this is how much money we spend on travel per adult, to make sure that we're being equitable. So I'm really excited to see how this plays out this year. Okay, so here's the ILT, the role of the ILT, who does the staff. So PAM allocations stand for PE, art, and music, but it's also plus technology, plus library. So they get one FTE for every 7 load-bearing teachers. So load-bearing teachers defined as the teacher of record, plus self-contained teachers, special ed teachers. The inclusion teachers don't because it's part of their planning bill. So they get one for every 7 load-bearing teachers, and then they're gonna work on their equity requests. And then they'll go and allocate, so we'll give them $1 per pupil for their non-personnel, and then they decide how to spend that money based on whatever they need. LSD improves it, and you're supposed to be monitoring their spending as the year goes on. And then when that comes in, we'll do all our analytics to figure out where we stand, and then we'll kick off the central office budget. So by state law, the board has to approve the budget by June 30, because I have to file it with the Hamilton County Auditor at their last meeting of the year, which is that last week in June. You have to, the board has to approve a appropriations resolution, or I can't run payroll. So that's the appropriations resolution is at the fund level, and that's how you all give me authority to write checks. So, base staffing is based on class size limits. We talked about PAM allocations. On our paras, we load them with overload based on what we know about those projections. Last year, we added an operational paraprofessional to every building, every elementary school, non-Montessori, because the CFT, Julie Sellers, kept complaining that overload paraprofessionals that were supposed to be tied to a classroom were being pulled out to do lunchroom and bus duty and that kind of stuff. So we said, okay, fine, we'll just give you a body, and that's what they're supposed to do, is all that business operation stuff, and they call them operational paras. And then for the schools that have, like the Montessoris, that require a para in every classroom, we just go ahead and put them there. The school social worker, everybody gets a minimum of 1 day a week, and that they can ask in their equity ask that if they need more. Clerical follows a formula. Every building by state law needs a plan operator. The only formula that we do that's not defined by a contract is assistant principals, and that's just what we came up with. So you have to have over 600 students to have an assistant principal, but you could ask for one in your equity ask. And then every school has a principal.
It's important.
Yeah, and then things that are centrally allocated but placed in the school buildings are things that are defined by, you know, the IEPs, the number of inclusion teachers, the Department of Student Services moves specialized classrooms around, but depending on space and how populations move. So they might have an MD unit here 1 year and then move it to another area the next year. Individual pairs are defined by IEPs. They used to call them Velcro IAs a long time ago. We're not allowed to say that anymore. So they're one-on-ones, but they're defined by an IEP. I already talked about in-school suspension securities, and we actually changed the formulas for counselors this year because we realized that our ratio compared to other districts was like really bad. And so we're trying to get to for every 350 high schools, it's 12 students. Right now we're targeting 450, so we're gonna, excuse me, graduate it up.
You're only 100 off from national recommendations. That's
What
good.
we did do,
That's
though,
great
we added,
progress.
in addition to that formula, we added 12 more for next year, so we have 2 that the K-8 buildings are sharing, because we realized that the 7th and 8th graders in K-8 buildings don't get any access to counseling, where the 7-12 kids do. So we're doing that, and then we added 10 more in the 7-12 buildings just to serve the 7th and 8th grade kids. Because that whole college career readiness stuff is really important to us.
So this is actually where I'd love to understand, in regards to, like, the budget, the amount that we get in, it's fixed, right? But then there needs to be, the flexibility that you have to just say, okay, we're gonna add an extra such and such resources. Is that through you being conservative on the projections, and therefore we brought in more than that conservative aspect, is that
Right.
buffer? Is
So-
that what
So
enables
that is a
that?
great question. The conversation that we have about expanding things only happens before we're building the budget. So it doesn't happen in mid-year, unless something like the state law changes and we have to address it, right? So for the most part, we always build in a contingency budget, so that when we forget to budget for something or some surprises, that we have some money set aside to deal with that. In 25 years in the district, our budget ask has never been below our budget target. Never, ever. So we always have to go through in the spring while we're building the budget and make decisions about what we're gonna shave back and what we're not gonna fund.
So like our corporate budget.
Yeah.
Where did the rest of the ASPE folks go, right? I mean, you've got
The lunchroom people.
lunchroom, custodial, all of that.
Yeah. So, custodians are centrally budgeted, and they do it based on square footage. Excuse me.
Okay.
You know, the cough drop. And so that's managed by the facilities department. They're actually served in the schools, but, they're budgeted centrally. So that's another area where we cost allocated out.
Okay.
The lunchroom managers are budgeted, by the student services department, and they're funded by a separate fund. Fund 6 is for food service.
Okay.
Same thing, they budget them centrally and then they sign it out to the buildings based on whatever the needs are. Is anything, ASME also has school community coordinators or assistants. One of them, the assistant school community coordinators or school community coordinators are not in the same union. One of them's in ASME, the other one's unrepresented, but I can't ever remember which one's which. And those are based by the school ask. So if they need help in the community or whatever, they'll do it as part of their equity ask.
Can you repeat the statement that you said for me? I'm a visual person, so I was
Okay.
writing it down. You said never in the 25 years has a budget ask been
Right.
inserted.
Right, so in October, I set the budget target. So just for argument's sake, let's say it's $600 million for next year, right? And then we go through this process where we're building the budget, and then after everybody has their budget templates in, the total of those has never been below my target. It's always high, because everybody always wants more, right?
Yeah,
So then we have a process while we try to balance it.
okay, all right. And you still put in a contingency for
Mhm.
those things to
Right.
come up.
Right, because our student projection formulas are 99.3% accurate from year to year, district-wide. Okay, that's after 20 years of doing it. School to school, grade by grade, not so much, right? Because it's really hard to predict where all the bodies are gonna pop up. And if a charter school closes down, then then you're surprised. So we have a contingency there, so in case we have to go hire teachers pretty quickly to address those issues, we can, we have the funds to do
one of the things Jen said earlier that's super important, because we've been talking about this for 4 months now in here, is the difference between governance and management, right?
Right.
And so Jen was saying at the beginning, the board's job is they set the strategic direction. Not necessarily their job to go line by line saying what we should be paying for things and what we shouldn't. Now, if sometimes there'll be things that will say like, well, the strategic direction of the board was we wanted more community engagement, but we don't see a significantly more money allotted for public affairs, right? So that is an okay thing to do. But I think where it gets really murky is, as Jen said, it is their day job to go back and figure out what is it we need, what did we do this year, and come up with that budget. But we often will see board members saying, line by line, tell me what this means, I think we need more money here, and that's, to be clear, not the job of a board member.
Right.
Also, the other thing to remember is the board can only act as a whole, so an individual board member, because they have a social justice item, or something that they're very passionate about, like Chris Nelms, for example, God rest his soul, is a wonderful board member, really into sports and athletics, right? So we always do, so when we do our presentations, we'll actually put on the wall, board member this cares about this, the board member this cares about that, and we make sure we try to address that in our public presentations. To prepare for the questions that are about to come.
Yeah.
Yes.
Although it's not their purview, if something goes wrong with the budget, doesn't come back on the board.
No, we'll come back to you on election,
Yeah.
Right.
but it's my license that's at stake. So I have a 5-year license with the state. I also have a contract with the board, and so, you would do that through my evaluation and decide not to reemploy me. I would lose like 10 weeks of sleep before I would allow that to happen.
Well, and also, like, just from a standpoint again of like, can you all be involved? By law, there are public presentations of the budget where we ask for input from the public. And it's
Yes.
very hard to get input from the public because
Yes.
I think for a lot of reasons, but one is it seems so hard to understand. And so I think one of the things is like, now that you all are getting this kind of information and starting to understand it, how can you kind of pull other people in when we get the notices, now that you're all signed up with Phyllis to get notices of everything,
Right.
that there's gonna be a public budget hearing? Can you take a couple friends along with you and go and listen to the presentation and give feedback? Or, like, those are the kinds of things that, you don't have to be a board member to be involved in the budget process.
So we actually talked about that recently because it's very frustrating to spend a lot of time and energy preparing these things and then you have 2 people show up at the public hearing. Right? And it was always very chill-like.
Aww.
Greg Rosen. And so, we kind of stopped putting effort into that, but then we got challenged by one of our board members who's really into public engagement, and rightly so. And so we've already scheduled the 2 public hearings that we're gonna have this winter. We'll be at school sites to try to make it more welcoming to people. And we're gonna have, like, students perform, and we're gonna have live streaming, and we're gonna have chat rooms, and make it, more for that level of workforce development, millennial inputter people. So it'll be fun. Oh, and the first one, it's not gonna be me, usually I'm there at the meeting room, slide by slide, and this data and that data and that data, and then people ask me questions, right? This year, we're gonna do a little bit more like an ESPN sports desk, where Laura and I are gonna be sitting at the table together, and we're gonna have like Renee Russo ask us questions, and it'll be funner.
Yeah, there you go.
I can't wait to see this one.
Yeah, so come. Make me feel like I spent time doing something good.
Treasurer's report, board members.
Yes, finance committee is always interesting. So, school district spending, like I said, the board gives authority to the treasurer by a resolution at the fund level, not the individual line item. So you'll adopt the budget by operating in it, but not necessarily by line item. But all you do is adopt the budget. The way you allow me to spend money is through that appropriation resolution. Then I'll revise it as things go along. And so if we get like a $20 million grant in the middle of the year, I have to put it in a resolution. You have to give me authority to spend that money. Okay? And then at every public.
How does that work if you get something in mid-year?
Well, I kind
Because
of.
you've already done your budget forecasting.
Right. So I would ask for resolution modification and if it's something significant, if it's a $500 grant, I'm not gonna, I'll wait and do it mid-year or whatever. But if it's something significant, it's good to do that stuff in public because then public hears about these wonderful things that are happening. But technically, I'm supposed to have, a resolution giving me authority to spend the money before I do so. It kind of depends on what fund it goes into, because what we'll do, like, some of our local funds, 18s and 19s, we won't create the value of the annual appropriation based on what the grants we have. We'll just look at historical and we'll make it bigger. As long as I have enough cash to cover it, that gives me a little bit of wiggle room of authority. So for every public meeting, I will present there's 2 reports that come through for approval, the superintendent's recommendations that comes for, they hire the bodies, and I do pay the bills. So the treasurer's report will ask for contracts. I have authority to do contracts that are under $25,000 without board approval. Anything over board approval, or if it's, even if it's under board approval, but I think it's significant, the public should probably see it, the board needs to see it, I'll put it in there anyway. Because I'm the queen of transparency. Then analysis is a topic that's very difficult for people to understand. I'm struggling getting our employees to cooperate. I have to sign a special certificate that says the money was there then when the district incurred the expense, and now when I'm paying the bill, because it means an employee obligated the funds before they have authority to do so. They forget, they can't just pick up the vendor, call the vendor and say, hey, I need a bus for my field trip tomorrow, without a purchase order. A purchase order is their only authority, because they think, I have budget, I have authority to spend. No, you don't, it's a purchase order. And when we do that, if it's under $3,000, I can go ahead and pay the invoice. If it's over, I need board approval to do so, and I have to sign a certain certificate. Last summer, I got an invoice from a vendor where a teacher called and ordered books for the library or something, and the vendor wasn't even registered with us, so I refused to pay the bill. I told the vendor, I said, go call the teacher. We have to register all of our vendors because it goes through a terrorist watch system to make sure that we're not doing business with criminals. And all donations and award grant awards go through the treasurer's report as well. So what controls do we have in place so that you're assured that we're spending money appropriately? The employee creates a requisition. Here we go with my little acronyms again. They put a requisition in the system. We have software that does it that says, I want to buy 10 computers. It goes through the budget system. They make sure the funds are there, or it will fail in the software anyway. And then it looks like, depending on the funding source, I might have to go through grant compliance, because federal grant rules are different than state grant rules, blah, blah, blah. And then depending on whether we need board approval or not, a purchase order will get created. So, when I get presented with an invoice, the purchase order has to match the invoice, which happens to match the receiver. So I tell the schools, you order 10 computers, and I get an invoice for 10 computers, but unless you acknowledge that you received 10 computers, I'm not paying an invoice. And, so it's a 3-way match to prevent us from overspending. This is in development, so it'll probably change 100 times before I officially make it public, but we're having a lot of confusion about gift cards and food. The state auditor, Ohio State Auditor, David Yost, who's going to be the Attorney General next, said gift cards, no, it's not so the state auditor says every spend, is it a proper public purpose? And you say, well, what does that mean? Well, it's pretty nebulous, but basically, is it furthering the education of the child? If it's not, don't spend it. So I keep telling our people, when you're out traveling and you're at a conference, don't get a lobster dinner, because that's not a proper public purpose. Gift cards are not a proper public purpose. We can't control the spend. They can take that gift card and go buy alcohol or tobacco or something, right? A lot of theft in gift cards. So the state auditor says no. But see, we have these 3 competing things that their answers aren't always the same, and they're very confusing. The Ohio Ethics Commission is where you guys as board members will get in trouble by accepting sports tickets or gifts of any kind. And it depends on if it's where the proper source came from. So if it's from a vendor, don't do it. Not too long ago, a lot of us got invited to the box office at FC Cincinnati game after we made the deal and stuff like that. I said, thank you very much, but I'm not allowed to accept that. So, people forget, right? If it's coming from GE, who is not our vendor, because they build aircrafts, right? It's okay to accept gifts from them if they're de minimis, which means they're not much value. But then again, the IRS could say it's taxable income, okay? So you have to, I'm trying to get principals to understand, and they always want to have these welcome back staff meetings where they bring food in. the state auditor says no, it's not proper public purpose. It's okay if you're doing professional development and you're in a place that doesn't have a restaurant. So when we're in the ed center and we have a professional development, we can't pay for food because we have a cafeteria that provides food. So, but if we go to the Rawson estate and have professional development there, there's not an easy way to bring food in, so it's okay for us to bring food if we work through lunch. And the IRS says if it's done on a regular basis, then it becomes taxable income to that employee. It's crazy, right? Because here we have this big power development initiative, we wanna bring people in and reward them and give them incentives and stuff like that, but we can't give them funds to do it. We know of a treasurer who was a board member in one district, was a treasurer in another district, and a vendor from the board member district came to his building and gave him a gift, and he took it, and he was convicted of a felony. Lost his job, he can never consider hiring him. It makes us treasurers very nervous. Clothing, you know, we're always wanting to buy Mike Tomorrow t-shirts, okay. And it's not allowable unless it's required by your job, and they define that as, you know, police officers, custodians, security assistants. They're typically not gonna wear that to church on Sunday or to a restaurant on Saturday evening. But a My Tomorrow initiative or logo or a little polo shirt, we probably would, so that no, it becomes a taxable, but you can't use public funds to do so. So you have to find a grant and then be willing to put it on your W-2.
But the PTO can buy those.
Yes.
So what can I?
PTO.
Yeah.
If they're willing to do so. So, questions? Oh my God. Right. If you guys think of questions, I'm sure Lisa can forward them to me if you so choose. When you become a board member, I usually will schedule time and I'll sit with you and go through a bunch of stuff. So there's plenty of opportunity to learn more. I know this is overwhelming, but this is probably more than you ever needed really to know. But I really appreciate your questions and your attention. This is fun.
I have some questions.
Sure.
I mean, I don't hold anybody.
That's fine.
So going back like 2 slides where you're talking about school district spending, I just wanna kind of rehash whatever, on the second bullet. Like, so that treasure report, that's the thing that comes to the business meeting, and you'll make sure that it's clear about anything that's over 25,000, anything that's over the 3,000.
Right.
Because you will need the board to.
Right. It'll be a blurb on there that'll say, that allows the treasurer to enter into a contract with Metro to provide high school transportation for this period of time, using these funds for this value.
Okay.
A lot of times it'll say not to exceed.
Okay.
Or it'll be an order of purchase order, we wanna buy 50,000 computers because we're replacing them all. So, yeah. But, you know, you're allowed to ask questions on the floor, too,
Okay.
for clarification if we're not clear.
Okay. And then the board in that moment, or do they have to pre-plan and build like, and create a resolution, or can they in that moment say, okay, we're good?
So board meetings run, we use Robert's Rules of Order, and then so the board president will say, I need a motion to approve the treasurer's report. And then a second, and then any discussion or questions, and then we do a roll call. So a lot of people will say yes on this, but no on that item, or I abstain from that item because it might be a relative or, you know, something. So you'll go through a lot more training for that stuff.
Okay. Cool, and then the next slide, it's interesting, just from this is a quick one, like for food examples. Like when the state auditor says no for the teachers, but then rewards and recognition is also about talent development.
Yes.
You know?
Yes.
You're not gonna attract great talent if you treat them like crap.
Right.
You know?
So the way,
what's the
what we're
argument?
trying to figure out is if we can find a grantee, or grantor, or the grantee, to say, we'd like to give the district a grant to support these initiatives and buy these things, has to be very specific. Then we should be able to do that, but we have to be careful about who that grantor is, make sure it's not a vendor, because they're not trying to buy our business.
Right.
And whether the value of those things are taxable or not. So, the state auditor only looks at public funds, but once we receive the public fund, even if it's a donation from one of you all to say whatever, it's still public funds and it still has to go for proper public purpose. We think we can argue that talent development initiative stuff is proper public purpose. as long as we're not trying to avoid compensating people by giving them things, right? So that's where it's really sneaky, it's very confusing, so we just have to really think it through and do a plan. So the assistant superintendents that are in charge of that project are supposed to come to me with like, this is our best, our dream.
Yeah.
And then we're gonna, Dan, my legal counsel, and I are gonna go through it. I'm actually gonna send it to the state auditor and say, bless this. You can't go back and give me like ding dong.
Right, right. And why is it easier, or at least appears to be easier for corporate America? Like, so for t-shirts, we make t-shirts all the time. Like, I've got one vice president of this, he wants a t-shirt for every launch,
Right.
everything. And it's like, and he laid them out the last time we had this business meeting, there were like 20 t-shirts. Whoops.
Because we're not using taxpayer dollars.
Okay, that wasn't easy.
Right.
So, I don't know if this is a you question or not, but how would that go into some professional development and get continuing education hours? Like, that's a big appeal.
Right.
But typically, if you're,
It furthers
Because how does it
education
work?
because it
Because
helps
it
with
works?
their licensure.
alright,
Mhm.
I just wondered how,
Yeah.
so that's the appeal for a lot, I would say a lot of teachers, is you have to have so many hours of continuing education credits. And I know, for me, it's like, most of that's not necessarily if I get lunch, that's a nice perk, but really it's that continuing education credits,
Right.
that way I don't have to
Right.
spend 300 of credit hour at a college.
But at the same time, when you're doing a professional development, you have 50 people in the thing, and they all go to 50 different restaurants, it's hard to bring them all back.
That's true too.
So
Yeah.
there's a convenience thing too.
Yeah,
So those
no,
ones
I
are
think,
okay,
I
as
think
long as they're not done
lunch should-
every week.
I don't understand why lunch shouldn't be provided, that I do think is very easy, but.
Right, and it can be,
Right,
if it's
so long as there's.
professional development, it's off-site, and
But
it's, the agenda
If you
dictates
have
that.
a professional development, like at the beginning of the school year, but school hasn't started yet, well, your staff are not on duty during lunch, so technically, your cafeteria is not open.
Right, but,
Uh,
so use
but
other
since I-
funds, don't use
Yeah.
the
Right, but.
things that he'll audit. He's gone through the conferences and bragged about how many people he's put in jail, David Yost, because that's like his thing.
And we can vote him out, right? I mean,
Well, he's now-
Is he,
he's
is he like that
elected.
elected?
He's now the attorney general, so now he puts
Yes.
people in jail for doing those things.
Yes. So, I have another question for you too, but, and I'm gonna send you all a very long logistics email, cause I was making the call while sitting here that I'd rather you hear from Jen than hear logistics, so just read your email, no, this is so much more important. But I also was thinking, Shannon, back to one of your questions, long time ago, of can you carry money over? One of the things, Jen, by law you have to do, right, is like, we can't budget that we're gonna spend every last dollar.
Right.
So do you wanna explain that, about how much money you have to show you have, or it's a percentage, you have to show you have in the bank?
We cover, if we have things that are encumbered but not yet paid out, so we have a contract with transportation, right, and we've done the busing, but we haven't received the bill yet. Those budget dollars carry over from one year to the other, so that the appropriation that the board approved is there, and the invoice comes in, and gives me the cash to pay, right?
Yeah.
State law says, I'm not even sure it's state law, but it's probably ODE rule that says, they look at our forecast, and if I have less than 2% of the previous year's revenue in my cash account, then they put us on fiscal watch. They start monitoring us more closely, and then if we go into deficit spending, then it's fiscal caution or takeover. But we won't get there. It's all
What's
about
that
us.
number again?
What's that?
What was that number?
It's 2% of the previous year's revenue.
So I was just thinking about that, like, yes, we do carry money over year to year. Cash money, yes.
So we're talking difference between cash and budget, two different
Yes.
things, right?
Yes. And then the other thing too, when we were talking levies, and again, I feel like I keep doing all these like calls to action, because I know this group's trying to figure out what we wanna do. You all saw how much of our budget depends on our levies, and our like, if those levies don't pass, it is dire for our district.
Yeah.
And so that is one of the things too, that again, they're on the ballot so often that I think people just don't even like, they don't even, there's another levy, or why do we all these levies? And so I think again, the more we can, because like I said, board members, staff are going to community council meetings all the time, the more we can have people talking to people. Like, you're the one talking at your own community council meeting, you know, in your neighborhood about how, hey, this is super important, we have to pass this levy. That's even more effective than me, random board member who is not part of your neighborhood, going to do that. And so the more that you all can, when you hear a levy coming up, or saying, how can I be involved, how can I help with this levy, what's the campaign you need?
Right.
the better, because those are critical in our district to us having money.
Wasn't there one on the ballot?
Yeah, there was.
Was one was,
Yeah, that was, like, I voted.
No, that was for this, for
that wasn't
CPS.
for us.
Right, that was for, that CPS kids would get credit for
They get extra points on the state test
test.
for, police and fire.
So there
That wasn't
wasn't a
our,
levy
no.
question?
There was a
Levy.
child services levy.
Yeah.
That's what it
Which I
is.
was
Yes.
not- which I
That was
thought
number
was
nine.
linked to
No.
CPS.
No,
Okay.
that's the child services
No,
levy.
No, that was just jobs and
I
family
thought we had
services.
1 year, I didn't have to do a levy.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which is interesting, because I think when you're just throwing out levy, like,
Yeah, you kind of.
Yep.
people go, didn't I just vote?
That's
Didn't I
real,
just
I
vote for
just thought-
that?
Yeah, well, and that's Jeff's point, right, I'm like, oh, look at here, of like the fatigue, the confusion.
Yeah,
I mean, and the amount of
absolutely.
energy and also money, I mean, levy campaigns aren't free, and we can't pay for them through we being the district cannot, no.
Right.
That's outside money that's fundraised, but still, there's money that gets involved, because you have to get a campaign out there, it's
Flyers.
yes, and
Commercials
hangers and
and-
commercial, and so the amount of resources in terms of human resources, money resources, anxiety resources, of this doesn't pass, to have to do this every single year is.
So the levy that will come up in November, that's not a new levy, so it won't
Right.
change.
Right.
It doesn't change like my property tax, it's gonna stay it'll stay the same.
Yep.
Now, if it didn't get passed, then that'd be an issue for
So-
the district.
Right, so the new ones, that, it was hard for all of our public to understand, was on a fixed sub levy, no matter what happens, we still get the same amount of money, so when values go down, you guys have to pitch more in. The political side of that is, all those abated properties, those taxpayers aren't participating in raising those monies. So that makes the poorer families, or the less knowledgeable families, ends up paying more of their share. That was a whole fight with FC Cincinnati, because they wanted to participate in, they didn't want to be taxed.
But they will be taxed. Is that
Well, so
the
we
resolution?
created an agreement with them that they're prepaying their tax, and then after their stadium is built, we'll reevaluate and figure out where they stand, and then right size that, and then they'll, in the 10th, 11th year, they'll start paying the taxes. Like, they kept saying, well, in a MLS startup, we can't afford to pay taxes. I said, that's bullcrap. So we negotiated the prepayment, because he's using capital dollars instead of operating dollars from MLS to pay the bill, so we're getting like a $9.9 million payment in June, where they're prepaying taxes. So, but I knew they were underestimating the market value of their stadium, and I said, fine, when it gets finished, we'll have it reevaluated, and we'll right size. If you owe us money, you owe us money, and then they sign on the bottom line. So I'm not very trusting when stuff like that happens.
No, I think that's great. The cap conversation, is that's a state thing, that's not a
It's
federal?
a state, that's in the funding
Like,
formula, and it changes every 2 years with the governor's budget, and whoever makes the decisions. It used to be 7.5, then they lowered to 5, now it's 3, so it's a little bit harder to deal with each year.
My last question is, what looks like help from the board, and then from, like, just think about the major challenges, what looks like help? So from board members or future board members, and then from legislative branches or state requirements, like, what looks like help?
This is a good question. So what Elisa was saying was help sell the levies. Help people understand, help educate community members, because this is confusing stuff. And, everybody has busy lives, they don't have time to investigate all that stuff. So that's one. 2 would be, talk to the legislators about fixing the funding formula, or just getting the charter school stuff out of our business. We employ 3 embodies to track down charter school stuff that we wouldn't have to do if they weren't part of our pass-through monies.
So would it be beneficial if they had their own, like, I'm just wondering about cities and municipalities that have like a charter district thing that's like a separate presiding thing that doesn't impact, like, I think DC's that way, right?
Yeah, there are a lot of cities that have a charter, like it's not going through their district, they have a
Yeah,
charter.
it's not
district
very
that's
big, and they have to raise their own,
Right.
they have to raise their own.
That'd be great.
Yeah, or even the state funding is going to that, not through the
Not
district.
through, yeah,
and then in,
that's, yeah,
yes.
that's to me, like, that would be a simple way to, to alleviate the burden on CPS.
Yeah, I even think about that came out during some meeting about even just our responsibility for transportation for private. Like that, if they wanna associate a certain amount of money to subsidize that, let them do that through their own, like funnel
Right.
and.
Because we could gain efficiencies if we could combine all those things, but you don't wanna put charter school kids on the same bus with our kids because they fight, right? So we can't gain efficiencies and fill our buses that way. Everybody's on different buses.
And then, well, no, that's separate from our treasure. Okay.
Good questions, great questions.
It's a lot to take in.
Yes, it's great though.
I don't know if I
I
understood
love
the
both of
numbers.
That is why the board employs me.
That's right, exactly. And I know we usually spend time like letting everyone have a few minutes to like quietly reflect. So I'm gonna assume y'all are gonna go all night and let this all sink in. And then like Jen said, if you have questions, let us know. Jen is so responsive and great. And also at every board meeting, so if you ever go to board meetings, Jen's there. And she asks questions.
I guess one question I have is that at the level, like, cause I think most people get involved in school board work because they want the systemic or whatever change they wanna see happen. So like, this is always kind of the afterthought, like sadly, but it's also the thing that drives everything.
Yeah.
When someone's coming up with the idea because they're passionate about sports, and like this is the grand thing they want to see, like, is that why you're at the board meetings? Like, taking notes, like, nice idea, but like, to what extent are you like the reality checker?
Oh.
For me,
Yeah.
well, I'm officially the secretary of the board, so I'm responsible for all the minutes. that the
Which
board
helps,
is
right? Because you're just like, oh, like, okay, that's nice.
Well, I have found on occasion where I need to do a little reality checks with the board, so, you know, you can attest to this, I've said this before. Great idea, what are you gonna not spend that money on so that you can spend that idea, right? Because I can't go sell more diapers, you can't go generate more revenue that way,
Right.
so we do that, and then, we were laughing the other day about the time they were talking about everything they wanted, and I'm like, well, that's great, but now you got like a 28-mil levy, it's never gonna pass. Dead silence in the room. I mean, they were all bubbly, I want this, I want that. So there's times when I have to.
Yes, and so I think and I also, because that was really, we had come up with all of the things, it was when we were coming up with what our levy was gonna be for and about and all that, and it really did add up to like 28 mils, and we were like, yeah, we have to get that down to like 8 mils. Yes, but I also think that one of the things that Jen and Laura and Mary beforehand were really good about in terms of how we set our budget and how we spend our money was always thinking about the impact on kids, right? And so I think to Tim's question, when things come up that's like, this is something that's been proven to work in other districts, can we do it here? The question is, yeah, but what are we gonna not spend money on? But like, what are we gonna not spend money on that's not giving us a reward right now for the money we're spending, so that we can do that thing? And I'll say in particular, one thing that I know a lot of people who are here know about is the high school start times. And, you know, I brought that up 1,000 years ago, right, of when the research first came out. And I had said, and it was in a budget meeting, and I had said, so here's all this research, it's showing this thing is better for kids. Like, there's a lot of things in education that are not settled if they're better for kids. This is one that, like, unequivocally the data shows is better for kids, right? But we know there's gonna be cost involved when it comes to buses, we know there's gonna be headaches, you know, so I don't know, and Jen, I'd rather remember this, Jen's response was, well, if it's right for kids, we're gonna figure out the rest. Like, that's what Jen's response was, as like, probably everybody was like, oh my gosh, there's so many logistics involved in this and dollar signs, but I do think though that is the orientation of the people at the district office, is if it's right for kids, we're gonna figure out how we align our budget for it.
You're gonna be so excited to hear this conversation we had with Josh yesterday. We were talking about how we're gonna evaluate the council.
Okay.
The work that is well. But then we're gonna go back to see if it worked.
To see if it worked,
Yeah,
yes.
and we will fund it the next year. So
Yeah.
the superintendent's meeting is amazing.
Yeah.
I was like,
Yay! Thank you so much, Jen, we really appreciate your time, we know you have a million things on your, yeah, so thank you.
You know, there's a really interesting connection to Virginia Tech.
yeah. What's that?
Nikki Giovanni, who's from Lincoln Heights.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I didn't know until I moved